fast.
I will start the session actually. We are running out of time now. So without having take much time, I would like to call three speakers. First one is Dr. Rajkumar Singh. Dr. Rajkumar Singh. Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. And second one, Suditya Kant Ghising. Okay, you're here. And third one is Dr. Lobzang Samdup. So Lobzang Samdup is on the way. Okay. And so as per the panel rule, you have maximum 20 minutes. So you have to wind up your presentation within 20 minutes. So without having taken much time, I would like to hand over to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Rajkumar Singh, and he will give a presentation on pilgrimage route to the political borders, monasteries, and transformation of the Indo-Tibetan trade network. So you have 20 minutes. Start, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tibetan Policy Institute, for allowing me to present my work from pilgrimage route to political borders, monasteries, and the transformation of Indo-Tibetan trade network. My research traces the political, economic, and moral roles of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, beginning in the era what I personally called as Buddhist Silk Road, moving through the disruption of colonial and post-colonial borders, and into their complex adaptation in exile. So, monasteries, since the time of when there was a Silk Road, these monasteries were situated along important trade and pilgrim route and serve as an important long-distance commercial hubs and places of worship. Caravans or merchants which were traveling from Lhasa, Purang, Ladakh, and Indian plains often stopped at monasteries such as Tabu, Sakya, Thosilnupa to seek shelter, pay levies, store goods, and receive ritual blessings. So, in this way, monasteries operated as caravans and financial intermediaries, providing material support and cosmological protection for merchants. So, as a scholar Ghising has written, this entainment of trade and religious legitimacy enabled these institutions to accumulate wealth, manage land holdings, and exercise judicial authority over mobile and settled population. Monasteries who were deeply embedded in what at present we scholars called as moral economies, system of exchange which were governed by religious ethics, social trust, and karmic obligation. In these settings, trade was not purely transactional but ritualized and embedded in spiritual practices. Merchants were expected to offer donations, dana, to monastery in exchange for prayers, blessing, and ritual protections. In turn, monasteries offered safe lodging, mediation services, and conducted proprietary rituals to ensure the success of commercial ventures. Such exchanges were guided by Buddhist principle of merit making, punya, non-harm, ahimsa, and right livelihood, samyak ajiva, blurring the boundaries between economic activities and religious duties. In addition to their ritual and spiritual function, monasteries perform sophisticated financial roles that closely resembles early banking institutions. They accumulated wealth, land, grants, donation, and tax collected in kind, reinvesting these resources in local economies. Grain banks, which were managed by monasteries, lent food and seed to villagers, while goods such as salt, wool, and butter were stored in monastic vaults for redistribution during festival or lean season. Such monasteries credited traders or provided secure storage during the long winter months. These transactions were meticulously recorded in monastic ledgers, such as Bakyak, which outlined protocols for treasure, debt management, and merit-based investment strategies. As Berthe Johnson mentioned in his book, monasteries also exercise judicial and administrative authorities in their region, often functioning as de facto courts and local governance. And they were involved in resolving land dispute, enforced trade contracts, and levied ritual fines. Their ruling were respected not only because of their scriptural knowledge, but also they embodied a higher moral authority grounded in Buddhist ethics and communal trust. As Lukian Pich notes in his study of the Ladakhi kingdom, the lamas were more trusted than lay officials. They were indispensable in maintaining regional order, particularly in frontier zones where state institutions were weak or absent. The integration of monasteries into economic and political life was not only present in Tibet, but most of the like Buddhist regions that were there. In these systems, religious institutions manage endowment, extended credit, and finance public work, all while acquiring spiritual merit for the institution and its patron. As Hildberg Dimberger argues, Tibetan monasteries institutionalize a dual logic of sacred accumulation and ritual distribution, ensuring their durability across political transition and environmental uncertainty. However, all of this, the disruption came with the arrival of the British when they started demarcating the borders. Before them, the border was a very porous, and the trade was, monasteries had a role in all that. So, Britishers, through mapping, treaties, and administrative reorganization, the British attempted to impose a fixed linear conception of borders on a region that had historically operated through porous overlapping sovereignties and ritual geographies. The establishment of custom houses, the introduction of trade regulation, and the demarcation of border through the Simla Convention 1914 systematically bypassed monastic authorities. It eroded monasteries' integrative role in the region's economy and diplomacy. The British-led trigonometrical surveys and related mapping projects rendered Himalayan terrain into a grid of measurable coordinates, replacing fluid religious landscape with rationalized political boundaries. Sacred trails that once connected monasteries, trade routes, and pilgrim sites were reclassified as frontiers and border. And as James A. Scott argues, such state simplification sought to make complex societies legible to bureaucratic administration, erasing the layered cosmological significance of space that had defined the regions for centuries. The redefinition of land as property, border as security lines, and mobility as threat directly undermined monasteries' ritual authority and logistic centrality in the borderland governance. However, the major disruption intensified after the Chinese annexation of Tibet in 1950s and the subsequent flight of Dalai Lama in 1959. As Sakya notes that this period saw the erasure of monastery not just as building but as sovereign institution within the Tibetan society, as most of these monasteries were destroyed by PLA. Despite this violent dislocation, Tibetan monasteries were not merely passive victims of geopolitical transformation. In the wake of destruction and exile, many monasteries began to reimagine their purpose and strategies for survival. Particularly in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, displaced monks, nuns, and lay supporters undertook the complex task of rebuilding religious sites and entire system of ritual governance and education. With the support of Indian government and international Buddhist organizations and donors, refugee monks established new monasteries in places such as Dharamshala, Bailakuppe, Sarnath, and Dehradun. These sites became critical hubs for transmitting Tibetan religious heritage. In Dharamshala, Namgyal Monastery, the personal monastery of His Holiness, was re-established alongside with other major institutions such as Gyudo Tantric Monastery and Library of Tibetan Works and Archive. These centers preserve religious teaching and ritual practices and became platform for cultural diplomacy, community education, and the refugee administration. The monastic economy in exile shifted from its traditional dependence on agrarian surplus and regional trade to a model grounded in transnational patronage, ethical gift economies, and global Buddhist network. Without access to conventional caravan commerce or state-backed land grants, monasteries turned to international donors, NGOs, and diaspora community to sustain their institution. A sponsorship programs such as Adopt a Monk or Sponsor a Prayer become a commonplace, with donation fundings everything from food to robes to healthcare and monastic education. And as McLagan observed, Tibetan monastery in exile became adept in navigating global field of cultural activism and philanthropic engagement, projecting an image of authenticity and urgency to mobilize support. Monasteries had to train monks in ritual, philosophy, administration, English communication, and senior monks began managing bank accounts, preparing projects for foreign donors, and liaising with international organizations. Thus, the monastery evolved into a bureaucratic religious hybrid institution that preserved ancient lineage while adopting modern organizational forms. These changes echoed earlier forms of monastic governance which were there in pre-modern Tibet, where treasurer and abbots kept detailed ledgers and enforced financial codes outlined in monastic regulation. As Barthe Jansen shows, monasteries historically maintained rigorous system of accountability which have been reactivated and recontextualized in the exile era to meet new ethical and operational demand. In Dharamshala and elsewhere, rebuilt monasteries consistently replicated their Tibetan counterparts' layout and aesthetic element, recreating assembly halls, debate courtyards, murals, and statues. These spatial reproductions were more than architectural choices, they were acts of mnemonic reinscription designed to sustain a sense of continuity and place in conditions of dislocation. Through festivals such as Mollam, mass dance, scholastic debate, these institutions perform the rituals of sovereignty and sacred order in a land of exile. Such practice, what Yal Navarro Yashin mentions, calls affective spaces where material reconstructions becomes a means of emotional and political reattachment to a lost homeland. Monks who began to travel internationally to give teaching, conducted rituals, and participated in interfaith dialogues and human rights forums. These performances were religious events and strategic acts of visibility, staging Tibetan identity for global audience sympathetic to the Tibetan cause. In exile, Tibetan monasteries have become living archive spaces where memory is preserved, performed, and transmitted through embodied religious practices. Faced with the loss of homeland and the disruption of territorial sovereignty, monastic institutions have cultivated ritual continuity as a mode of resistance. Daily chanting, debates, mass dance, and the meticulous reproduction of a calendric festival enact a performative memory that sustains. Monastic institutions of exile have invested heavily in preserving and transmitting classical Tibetan language, canonical texts, and scholastic tradition. Monastic schools such as Buddhist logics, Pramana ethics, Tibetan grammar, poetics, and historiography, ensuring students internalize the intellectual framework that undergirds Tibetan civilization. Institutions like the Library Tibetan Works and Archive in Dharamshala function as counter archives, collecting manuscripts, oral history, and visual record documenting the continuity of Tibetan cultural life despite geopolitical rupture. Many monasteries have established multilingual publishing houses that translate Tibetan scriptures, commentaries, and biographies into English, Hindi, and other European languages. Though these texts, monasteries assert narrative sovereignty over Tibetan history and identity, countering dominant geopolitical framing of Tibet as a peripheral or as a backward space. The act of translation becomes a political tool that opens up Tibetan thought to global audience while simultaneously affirming its philosophical depth and contemporary relevance. Non-violent resistance is another way that how monasteries are preserving culture through pedagogy and performance. Monasteries fend off the process of cultural erasure that exile and occupation threaten to impose by fostering continuity in ritual and intellectual life. With this, Tibetan monasteries, my conclusion, Tibetan monasteries have been central to the Indo-Tibetan region's socio-economic, political, and spiritual landscape. As their historical role extended well beyond religious institutions, they were institutions of governance, financial administration, and trans-regional mediation. In the pre-modern era, they facilitated commerce, resolved dispute, stored wealth, and sanctified trade through karmic and ritual legitimacy. The disruption through colonial cartography and Chinese annexation shattered these integrated systems. With the closure of trans-Himalayan trade and the destruction of sacred institutions, monasteries lost their territorial and economic base. However, exile did not render them absolute. Instead, Tibetan monastic communities reconstituted themselves through global networks, adapting their organizational form to include donor outreach, NGO partnership, and cultural diplomacy. In exile, monasteries have become a place of worship, learning, and sites of cultural memory, affective sovereignty, and non-violent resistance. Through ritual, education, translation, and digital presence, they project a Tibetan identity that is at once rooted in lineage and entangled in the world. Their refusal to disappear, to let exile become eraser, exemplifies what Graeber describes as resistance through continuity, the quiet power of institutions that endure by adapting without capitulating. These institutions continue challenging dominant narratives of Tibet as a politically passive or economically marginalized space. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Suditya. How do you spell that? Suditya. Yeah, Suditya Kant, question right. So, okay, your turn start.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suditya Ghising. I'm from Dorjee. I teach history at Assam University, Sikkim. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers here at Tibet Policy Institute for organizing such a wonderful conference. So far I've had a very pleasant experience. So without any delay, I would like to introduce the title of my presentation: The Merchants of Eastern Himalayas, the Lhasa Newar, and the Indo-Tibetan interaction in Kalimpong in the early 20th century. In my presentation, I'll briefly discuss about the nature of Indo-Tibetan interaction, the history of this interaction, and I'll also be touching upon how Kalimpong in the Eastern Himalayas became one of the most important Indo-Tibetan towns in the early 20th century. And I'll end with the decline of this trade, and I'll also be discussing about some of the traders who took part in this trade actively. So when we talk about Indo-Tibetan relations, the discussion often revolves around the spread of Buddhist culture, tradition, and monastic culture. While these are important, it only tells a part of the story. Beyond these narratives, there existed people-to-people interactions that shaped the historical relationship between the two regions, that is, the Indian subcontinent and the Tibetan plateau. The Himalayas, lying between the Indian subcontinent and the Tibetan plateau, they have long served as a vital convergence point with numerous routes facilitating interaction and exchanges. The trans-Himalayan world was not just a corridor of religious movements, but also a zone of trade, mobility, and cultural exchange. Everyday interactions through trade caravans, pilgrimages, and other such exchanges, it facilitated both the spread of religious ideas and the spread of material culture. Ludwig Stiller, he mentions that in the northern Himalayan region, the main occupation of the people was trade. More than a livelihood, trade also became an identity for many. For instance, one of the most prominent communities living in the Himalayas are the Tamang communities. The word Tamang, which translates to a horse rider or a horse puller, it originated as a result of this long historical economic tradition. So therefore, these interactions also helped in building the trans-Himalayan character. Now, if you look back at the history of the India-Tibet relationship, it actually predates the arrival of the English East India Company in the subcontinent. Many trace the beginning of this relationship to the marriage of the Lichavi princess Brikuti Devi with the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo around 7th century AD. So to put it into context, during that particular time, we had King Harshavardhana in India. So it goes back to that period. While other historical traditions suggest that the northern regions of the Indian subcontinent have maintained continuous engagement with Tibet. The then Kingdom of Nepal, particularly the Kathmandu Valley, played an important role as a key transit point for trade and even for pilgrimage routes leading to Tibet. Kathmandu then was an essential hub for merchants, pilgrims, and travelers navigating between the Indian subcontinent and the Tibetan plateau. An Italian priest by the name Ippolito Desideri in the early 18th century, that is in the 1700s, described Kathmandu as a thriving urban center, bustling with commerce and vibrant markets. It's interesting to also note that Ippolito Desideri was one of the first Jesuits who ever stepped foot in Tibet. One of his aim was to spread Christianity. So during his stay in Lhasa, he maintained a journal which has been published in a book now. So if anyone is interested, they can read that. He also mentions that a significant number of Tibetans and pilgrims from the Indian subcontinent, they frequently visited the Kathmandu city, engaging in trade and cultural exchange. Since we are discussing about Kalimpong in the Eastern Himalayas, it is important to understand the background and the context of how it became such an important Indo-Tibetan town. Kalimpong today is one of the most popular hill towns in the region that is North Bengal and was once notoriously labeled as the spy capital of the world. A lot was happening in the Eastern Himalayas, especially in the second half of the 18th century. The English East India Company, they had established themselves as one of the most powerful in the Bengal province following the Battle of Plassey, Battle of Buxar. But one significant event changed the entire course of events that was about to happen in the 19th century. And that event was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770s. It had a disastrous effect on the province, killed many people, many people died, and it also had devastating impact on the financial condition of the province as well. So the company realized that they required a market in order to sell their finished products. As Aurobindo Dev, he puts it, there was a desperate need for new channels of commerce and commercial ventures. There was this new economic interest towards Tibet that was developing in London in the late 18th century. They wanted to explore the feasibility of setting up markets in Tibet. Opportunity came with the first Bhutan Wars that materialized between the years 1772 and 1774. Now, if we understand the geopolitical importance of Eastern Himalayas in the 18th century and even in the beginning of the 19th century, we see that there were two major powers, invading powers. On the western side, we had the Gorkha Kingdom, and towards the eastern side, we had the Bhutanese. And right at the middle lay the kingdom of Sikkim. So Sikkim became strategically very important for the East India Company. And at the request of another king, that was the king of Kuch, where Bhutan was invading, the king requested the English East India Company. That time it was Warren Hastings. So Warren Hastings, he obliged and he interfered in that war, ultimately defeating the Bhutan during the first time. So the war ultimately concluded with a treaty between the then government of Bengal and the monarch of Bhutan. In the Eastern Himalayas, after 1774, Bhutan became an important access point between the Indian subcontinent and Tibet. After the 1774 treaty, between the then government of Bengal and Bhutan, the Bhutanese monarch, he agreed to allow the merchants who were coming from Tibetan side to pass through their territories so that they could go to the Indian subcontinent and engage in their trading activities. After the 1774 treaty, we observe that there are many such conflicts that take place in the Eastern Himalayas. Primarily, it was due to the East India Company's interest to secure the passage to Tibet. And then we start seeing many such consolidating activities. The Eastern Himalaya gradually gained preference over the Western Himalayas as a strategic route for cross-border interaction, and by the 19th century, this shift had become more evident. British ethnologist and a resident at the palace at Nepal then, Brian Hodgson, he said that Eastern Himalayan region had a geographical advantage over the Western Himalayas. He regarded it as more suitable for fostering or developing this Indo-Tibetan trade. He also observed that Western Tibetan region was relatively poor, rugged, and which made it less favorable for any such large-scale trade to be conducted. And other factors that made Eastern Himalayas much more important was the kind of political changes that was happening in Nepal. Nepal was going through a unification process. So there was this belief that the then Gorkha king, Prithinaran Shah, and many rulers after him, they grew suspicious of the merchants due to their loyalty towards the erstwhile rulers, the Malla kings. Consequently, he restricted and eventually cut off the flow of trade through Kathmandu. But this was one of the most important points that I had, before undertaking this research, that I thought the development of Eastern Himalayas as this important Indo-Tibetan center was due to this factor. But after conducting my researches, I found out it was something else. It was other, more factors that had nothing to do with Nepal. So I discussed earlier about this consolidation activity that happened in the 19th century. The first one started with the Gorkha kings. They were defeated by the British, and later on, the king of Bhutan was defeated. And after the Bhutan wars, about 1/5 of the territory of Bhutan was taken over by the British, including the Duars area in Bengal, as well as some of the Duars area in Assam, and the territories west of the river Teesta, and including Kalimpong. So this development opened up new possibilities for expanding trade with Tibet through the Chumbi Valley, as the primary threat to the kingdom of Sikkim had now been eliminated. Both the Gorkhas and the Bhutanese were stopped. With Sikkim now secure from the Bhutanese threat and the acquisition of the new territories, including the present-day town of Kalimpong and Darjeeling, the trade routes to Tibet were further secured and strengthened. One of the most important communities who contributed in making Kalimpong the Indo-Tibetan town of the 20th century were Newars, more specifically Lhasa Newars. So in his book, Shamu Kapu, D.S. Kansakar, he explains that in Nepal, there were primarily two groups of people or communities. The first one, they were the Gorkhas or the Parvatiyas, whose lingua franca was Nepali, and the other group who belonged to the Tibeto-Burman linguistic family, within which Newars were also classified. And even within the Newar community, there are two groups. One who follows the Shaiva Newar, and they are mostly considered the Hindu Newars, and the other one who follow the Buddhist tradition. So for this research, I had taken interviews of few of the families whose ancestors engaged in this trade, and I found out that initially the Newars who came from the Kathmandu Valley, they were actually invited. They did not migrate to the Eastern Himalayas as a result of the policy of the king, but they were invited by the royals of Bhutan for a wedding that they had. And mostly these Newars, they came from the Patan district. Like in Kathmandu, we have 3 districts, Patan, Kathmandu, and Bhaktapur. Patan is now today known as Lalitpur. So most of the Newars who came from Patan, they were exceptional artisans, craftspeople, right? So they were invited for their skills, and later on, many of these Newar from the Patan area, since they found out that there are opportunities available in eastern Himalayan town of Kalimpong, many of them slowly started migrating. But again, the distinction between that is what I've thought previously was all Newars are alike. They're all businessmen, business classes, but even they have that segregation amongst themselves. So the Newars coming from the Kathmandu side, they are much more established business people. They are much more well-versed in long-distance trade, while those coming from the Patan area, they are very localized, and they are much more skill-based, like artisanal skill-based. So the first argument that it was due to the political reason, so that is not the case. Over time, however, as the Tibet trade via Kalimpong expanded, a growing number of Kathmandu-based Newar traders also migrated to the area, establishing trading houses and participating in the Indo-Tibetan commerce. One of the most prominent traders were the Sakyas, whose descendants are still there in Kalimpong. Purnavir Sakya and Harkavir Sakya, who came from the Patan area, were among the earliest pioneers to establish a courier network or a courier service between Kalimpong and Lhasa, which became one of the first organized courier networks in the region. I also found out that jeans were very much in demand in Lhasa. And even automobiles, they were broken up and different individual parts were taken through these mules and all these horses. The success of these houses also depended on the long-standing socio-economic and cultural relationship between the Newar community and the Tibetans. For centuries, the Lhasa Newars, they had cultivated strong networks of trust, trade, and cultural interaction with the Tibetan merchants, monasteries, and officials. So these pre-existing relationships also provided them with preferential access to trade routes, security along the transit corridors, and a dependable client base that relied on their services. So these courier operations were not only limited to even like carrying letters or messages, but also transported like small consignment of commodities or goods, such as religious artifacts, which were vital to sustaining the Indo-Tibetan trade. The growth of Kalimpong as a prominent marketplace was not accidental, but rather shaped by its strategic geographical location and its proximity to the Calcutta port, which served as one of the most important gateways for international trade during the colonial period. Unlike many traditional routes connecting Kathmandu to Lhasa, which were rugged, treacherous, and prone to natural hazards, Kalimpong offered a relatively safer and accessible transit corridor for merchants engaging in this trade. Now, I would like to conclude with the decline as to why this trade declined. There exist several debates surrounding the decline of Lhasa Newar merchants and the Indo-Tibetan trade in the Eastern Himalayas. The first one, which I was very surprised, emphasized the religious composition of the Newar community that settled in Kalimpong. The majority of these traders were Buddhist Newars, as opposed to the Shaiva Newar. Their religious identity had direct implications for the security and stability in Lhasa, which served as the primary hub of their economic activities. Therefore, after the change in the political administrative setup in Lhasa, many of these Newars, they felt insecure, and as a result, many left. The Buddhist Newars, who had traditionally enjoyed certain privileges and networks in Lhasa, began to feel increasingly insecure under the new power dynamics and growing political uncertainty in Tibet. As a result, many Lhasa Newar families, they gradually withdrew from Lhasa, shifting their focus to other centers of trade. And even in this returning of the Newars, there are two different patterns. The business class, right, composed primarily of wealthy merchants who engaged in these large-scale trade, were among the first to return to Kathmandu. They sought the relative stability of the Kathmandu Valley, where they could reinvest their capital and rebuild their economic networks within the emerging commercial hubs of Nepal. Whereas the other artisanal Newars, they continued to stay in Kalimpong, and they continued to supply handcrafted items, religious art, decorative pieces to monasteries, traders, and local patrons in Kalimpong, Darjeeling, and Sikkim. The division within the Lhasa Newar community highlights an important transformation in the region's socio-economic landscape. While the merchant families reoriented themselves towards Kathmandu and shifted their business strategies to fit the changing dynamics of Nepal's economy, the artisan community, primarily those who came from the Patan area, contributed significantly to the local cultural and artistic heritage of Kalimpong and the Eastern Himalayas. And my final point for this one, building on the arguments put forward by economic historian Tapan Ray Chowdhury, who suggests that the cottage industries declined not because of colonial interference, but as a result of their inability to compete with the Western markets. Similar fate also had with the Lhasa Newari themselves. The Lhasa Newas had historically been deeply involved in various small-scale home-based industries such as weaving, metalworks, wool processing, and the production of artisanal goods, many of which were traded extensively across the Indo-Tibetan frontier. These cottage industries had formed the economic backbone of Newar commercial success for generations, linking their production networks in the Kathmandu Valley and Kalimpong with broader markets in Tibet, Bengal, and beyond. However, the 20th century marked a period of profound economic transformation in the Indian subcontinent, with the advent of industrialization and the introduction of machine-made goods, first under British colonial influence and later during India's own post-independence modernization efforts. The traditional cottage industries, they struggled to compete, and gradually all of these industries declined. With this, there was an end to one of the most significant chapters in history in the Eastern Himalayas, and I would like to conclude my presentation over here. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for your presentation. And next speaker is Dr. Lobzang. Please start your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Screen. And I also thank you to the Tibet Policy Institute to give us opportunity to share our views in the paper presentation here. So my topic is the socio-cultural ties between the Western Tibet and the Western Himalayan regions, the Ngari Korsum. Why I choose the topic, the justification to choose the topic is that the Tibet is a large geographical regions, so each share border with the most of the Himalayan region, like Eastern Himalayan, they share with the Eastern Tibet, the Southern Tibet, they share with the Southern Himalaya, and the Western Tibet, they share cultural relationship with the Western Tibet. During the 7th, 8th century, the first Tibetan emperor, during the Chogyal Mepo Namsum, it was a very big emperor. It used to rule over the Tibet and the Baltistan and the Himalayan regions. Now it's also called a Greater Tibet, the Pöchempo. That's why it has an influence of the culture, language, and the Tibetan Buddhism to the Himalayans, Bhutan, and till up to the Skardo and Baltistan, and also some part of the, I think, Central Asian and now Uyghur Xinjiangs. And they were the part of the Tibet. That's why it has shared with the culture with the Tibet. So the first king of the land, the Stot Ngari Korsum, he migrated from the central Lhasa when the Tibetan emperor dismantled into lots of small kingdom. And one of the Khordet Oshung and their descent came to the Western Tibet. And he ruled to the Western Tibet, Ngari Korsum. Skideng Ngimagon was the first king of the Ngari Korsum. He migrated from the West Lhasa kingdom, and he ruled the Ngari Korsum. Then his son, he has 3 sons. The older one, the Palgigon, ruled to the Maryu Ladakh, and the Tashigon ruled to the Gugye and Purang, and the youngest one ruled to the Zanskar and the Spiti. He divided the 3 provinces of the Ngari Korsum to his 3 sons. That's why I think the Ngari Korsum, they share the culture and close culture and the language relationship with the Western Tibet. Now some of the part are now in Tibet. Now it's captured by the Chinese, and the Ladakh is now the part of the Tibet, India, and also Spiti is Zanskar in the Ladakh areas, and the Spiti is now part of the Himachal. And then after also the 11th, 10th centuries, the first king of the Ngari Korsum, they came from the Lhasa, and also at the same time they also revived the Buddhism. During the Hlang Dharma, he destroyed the Buddhism, and it's called a later period of the Buddhism, 10th, 11th century. The Lhalama Ishiot, he invited the Choje Pada Atisha from the Vikramshila, and also Lobzang Rinchen Zambo, who studied in Kashmir and later back to the Tibet, and he translated lots of Tibetan Sanskrit texts to the Tibetans, and also he established 108 monasteries in the Western Tibet. And that is the reason the later Buddhism revived in the Tibet during 10th, 11th centuries. And also the Lobzang Rinchen Zambo, they built a monastery in the Tholing monastery in the Gugye, and some monastery in Ladakh, and one monastery in the Spiti. They have a same culture and the artistic style. Due to the monastery murals and the art is not like a Tibetan style. It is made by the Kashmiri artists in 11th centuries. That's why we can say that the spread of the Buddhism in the Western Tibet is in the same period during 10th, 11th centuries. And also before that, there may be Buddhist or Bon religions. I think they also prior to the nature, like shamanism and animistic religions. They prior to the nature, like waters and the trees. Some of the trees they never cut down. If they cut down, they believe to be exist of the spirit. In Tibetan, they call a hlu. And some of the water they don't do dirty. They believe if they do dirty and cut the trees, they bring bad luck to them. So I think it's some sort of to coexist, coexist living with the nature, to care the natures. And then after the Buddhism spread, then the Gugye first king was the middle one, the Tashi Gon, and then the Lama who invite to the Tibet, Lalama Isho, they were the descent of the Gugye and Purang first king. Later, the Tashidakpa, there was the last king of the Gugye and Purang. They used to live in 1622 to 1630. Then the Ladakhi king Singh Namgyal invaded the Western Tibet, Gugye Purang. There was what happened, often happened with the Western Tibet and Ladakh kingdom. I think in the history they said the war with the Tibet and Ladakh. I think it is wrong to say, because the Tibet and the Lhasa is very far away and the Ladakh is in the Western Tibet. They, I think, fight with the Gugye Purang and the Ladakh kingdom because they were used to be the descent of the same kings. Their grandfather was the same. So in the 1624, the Portuguese Christian missionary, they heard there is a Christian kingdom and Shambhala exists in the Purang. So they went to the Gugye to spread the Christian, and also they got permission from the Goa. There was a missionary center in the Goa who give them permission and the fund to spread the Christian in the Gugye. So they built a church in the Saparang and the Rudok. Later, I think they could not survive in the Tibet, and they left the Tibet in 1628. And the 1630 to 1680, Ladakh, Gugye Purang was ruled by the Ladakh King Singh Namgyal, and later the 1680, there was also danger of the Ladakhi King Singh Namgyal was a patronage and the sponsor of the Drukpa Kargyutpa. And in the Lhasa, there was main religious was follow the Gelugpa, and also the 14th and 15th century, the Tsongkhapa was born in Tibet, and then so in Tibet, the Gelugpa was become famous in Tibet. So there was lots of scholars born in Tibet, and some of the close disciples of the Tsongkhapa, they came to the Western Tibet, Ladakh and Gugye Purang, and they helped the local ruler to become to the Gelugpa sect. And also one of the disciples, Toshira Zambo, come to the Nubra in Ladakh to spread the Gelugpa, and the Gugye Ngawang Trakpa, who helped the Gugye kings to become a Gelugspa. And also there was around 60-80, there was a danger of there was some religious conflict between Gelugpa and Kargyutpa. So Dalai Lama, there was a fifth Dalai Lama in Tibet. He sent the Sopo Galdan Tsewang to Western Tibet to save them from to converting them to Kargyutpa. Then the Galdan Tsewang, somehow he could save the Gugye and Purang, but in Ladakh there was a Singh Namgyal rule. He could not, and also there was Ladakh was helped by the Drogra kings, and and also they made the treaty in the Tingmosgang, and in the treaty they make the Tibet and Ladakh border and some Rudok, and they can make a trade with Tibet and Ladakh, but they cannot. In the future they cannot, so could not happen the war. It's called Tingmosgang. Tingmosgang is a place in Ladakh where they made the treaty with the Mughal Ladakh and the Tibetan, the Sopo Galdan Tsewang, who was the Prime Minister of the Tibet, who was sent by the fifth Dalai Lama. For some period of time, I think he ruled the Tibet after the fifth Dalai Lama passed away, and also to manage the Potala Palace. I think the treaty was during the Ladakhi King Tashi Namgyal. And the religious transition, they also to Sakyapa. Early the Gugye Purang king was the Sakyapa, and they later changed to the Gelugpa after the Tsongkhapa born in the Tibet. And also there was Tsongkhapa close disciple came to the Western Tibet, like in Nubra, in the Ladakh, and the Spiti, and the Zanskar. They built a lot of monasteries, and they helped to the locals to become a Gelugpa sect. And also the Tabo monastery, this monastery are made in the 11th century. They share with the common artistic and the mural style of it's called a Gandhara style of arts. They have Tabo monastery in Spiti, Alchi monastery in Ladakh, and Tholing in the Gugye, and Tholing and Saparang in the Gugye. I think these are the 1,000-year-old monasteries in Tibet and Ladakh. And also the Buddhist rock art found in the Ladakh. Some of the Buddhist rock art they found in the Gandhara style in Ladakh, like Mulbek Maitreya. It's 11th century artistic style. And the rest of the Buddha rock art found in the Ladakh, they are the same arts in the Buddhist rock art found in the Gugye and Purang. So that's why we can imagine that the Buddhism came to the Western Tibet in same period. And also the Tashilumbu monastery, it was the center for the Western Tibet. Monks, they go to the Tibet to study Buddhism. So Tashilumbu is in the Jikatse. It's near to the Western Tibet. So it's easy to travel to Tashilumbu rather than to go to the Lhasa. central Tibet. The monks go to Tashilimbu to study. And also there are lots of monks in the Ladakh. They studied in Tashilimbu and they returned to Ladakh before the China occupied Tibet. And some of the monks, they become the throne holder of the Tibet. Throne holder is like a abbot of the monastery, the head monasteries. And also the rock arts found in the Western Tibet. There are lots of rock art found. It's called petroglyphs, like animals and hunting scenes. They are, it shows some connection. They also found in the Silk Road areas like Central Tibet, Western Tibet, Baltistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, and Central Asian and the Uyghur Xinjiang. It's somehow they have a culture and a trade relationship. Maybe this rock art written to show the path or to show some sign of the road. And also the Shon is a men's dance performance in the Western Tibet region, like Gugye Purang and the Ladakh, and also I think they dance in the Kulumana side. They used to, the anti-clockwise, they hold the hand and they do the dance. Like it's believed to be come from the Bon religion, like animistic religion, because the Shon dance, usually they dance in the clockwise. The Shon dance, they do dance in the anti-clockwise. That's why it's imagined like it's come from the Bon religions, because Bons, they used to go for to circumambulate the monastery and the stupa to anti-clockwise. And also the women wear the peraks on the head. The ornaments, it's in the same in the Western Tibet, in the Ladakh regions. And this is some performing the Shon dance in the Ladakh. And this one is in Gugye and Purang. And also they have ornaments on the women's, they wearing on the heads look like similar. And these are the Kinori dance. It's also like a Shon dance. They do performance during the religious festival. And the common folk song, they share the Western Tibet. Songs are the very common. They praising the peacocks songs, and there is lots of songs there where they share the same culture and the folk dance. And the language, usually the Tibetans, in the Lhasa, now it's used a modern classical language, which based on the modern language. In Western Tibet, they use archaic word. They have lots of archaic word because according to the time, the Lhasa, they speak, according to the time, they use lots of silent with the prefix and the suffix. In the Western Tibet, they still use the archaic word. They come from they believe to come from the Bon religions, and because they believe to the Xiangshung believed to be the Stodngari Korsum. And also the pronunciation of the Western Tibet and the Lhasa, the central is different. For example, we say chi. In Western Tibet, we say pe. In Lhasa, they say che, chemar, pemar. And fe means to open. In chi means in Lhasa, they say to open. Chi means to letter, and chitro, and we say pito. Fi on chi means in Lhasa, they call outside, and we call fi. And Shritpa, the Western Tibet, they call say like a Shritpa. In Lhasa, they Sipa or Sepa. This is a prefix Ra. And some of in the Balti, they use they pronounce like same as is written in the classical language, which in the Lhasa dialect, they use mostly silent. For example, if I say, Dre means for the rice. In the Balti, they say abras is they pronounce prefix, suffix, and the superscript and the subscript. Like abras means in Tibetan they write aw, ba, bara, da, 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 sa, das. O, Ba, Baratak, Ra. That's why they call Abras. They have a Ra in the subscripts. So in Lhasa, they doesn't pronounce like, because they, according to the time, they use like a very modern language. They more of the prefix and the suffix, they keep silence, like it's a like a modern language. And also in the exile, they use based on the Lhasa language. And the Balti is, for example, purest pronunciation of the classical Tibetan language, which made by the Thunmi Samboda in the 7th century, the Tibetan script and the letter system. These are some example of the different usage of the words in the Western Tibet and the Lhasa. The first one is they use in the Western Tibet side, and Kolwa, they are somewhat, maybe you don't know Tibetan. I think the culture and the culture heritage and the language and the songs and the language, they are the same cultures in the Western Tibet, Gugye, Purang, Spiti, Zanskar, and Ladakh regions. And also the Buddhism also later spread in Buddhism in the Tibet through the Western Tibet. And also Buddhist script translated mostly in the Western Tibet side, in the later spread of the Buddhism in Tibet. That's why the Western Tibet is more important to the culture and educationally and culturally. And so now the problem is that some part of the Western Tibet, Gugye Purang, is under the Chinese control, and some of the part is in India, Ladakh and Spiti. So they cannot accessible to each other territories and to share their culture. So they have a more like influence of the outsider influence. So their culture is in danger, I think in danger. So because of the Chinese influence and the outsider English the influence. In Ladakh, they have their own counting system now. There's in market and the children, they doesn't know. Everything they count in the English. So these are the sign of their distinction of the language and cultures. So thank you.
Thank you. I think you had very good lunch. I think that's why. Hope that you are active actually. We have 30 minutes for comments, questions, and answers. So for the first 15 minutes, we welcome the comments and reviews from the expert channels. After that,